Well, I'm in our Hermanus studio with Wendy Addison. It was a time you were all over the news in South Africa. How long ago was it?
In the year 2000 was when I left the shores of South Africa, 23 years ago.
It's quite a story, because up until that point, many people perhaps will not remember, but there was a health and racket club, which was, well, I suppose Virgin Active gyms today, but that's where it started. And then there was an enormous amount of fraud that went on, and two guys who were celebrated as great entrepreneurs ended up being sentenced to jail.
That's correct.
And it was a big stock exchange listed company, Joe Pamensky, the chairman. There were the high and mighty of South African business on the board. And the reason why the fraud was uncovered was Wendy Addison.
Correct.
Chartered accountant who was there and found stuff that wasn't that good. Looking back, are you sorry that you did what you did?
No, not at all. It's such a good question because it's been such a big story in my personal life. People assume it's a negative story, but I've learned so much about myself. I've met the most incredible people. You know, when I also think back to one of the drivers for me to speak out, it was the voice of my 12-year-old son at the time. And I remember sitting in my very plush office.
Were you a single parent?
I was a single parent. Dylan was 12 years old at the time. All I could think about was why I shouldn't speak up. I came up, obviously, with a number of rationalizations, many. But there was a nudging, persistent voice. And that was the voice of my son, not as a 12-year-old, but as a 20-year-old, my future son. And what might he ask me? If this is the scandal I think it is, what might he say to me if I do nothing now?
How did you go about reporting this?
Well, in those days, even though we had, there was an infant whistleblowing legislation mirroring the British PIDA, Protective Information Disclosures Act, whistleblowing wasn't on the radar. In fact, I didn't even know what a whistleblower was. What I did know was we were breaking the law. The person I reached out to was the South African Exchange Control Board. And the reason I did that was because we had a legal caveat with the South African Exchange Control Board where we were only allowed to transfer 50 million rand out into another country for development of new gyms. And I had discovered that there was more and more money going offshore, but into a Jersey bank account. I wasn't 100% clear whose Jersey bank account that was.
And remembering this was a listed company with shareholders who included retirees.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's also interesting that we had Jobe Arabi, who was very involved with Peter Gardner and Rod Mitchell. I knew that he had kudos in cutting corners and pushing the envelope. And so when I was asked to transfer another tranche of 50 million into this Jersey bank account, I dug my heels in. And I would have liked to have had a conversation with Peter and Rod about it and said, look, we're breaking the law. We can't do this. Is there not a better way? They were in Australia at the time. So I contacted Jobe Arabi and I pretended to be ignorant. And the reason I did that was I wanted him to give me instructions through his fax machine. So I had his fax number recorded. So it would be an additional instruction from a third party. And he sent this through to me, this instruction, and I dug my heels in even further. So when I reached out to the South African Exchange Control Board, it wasn't a reporting disclosure at all. It was a question I was asking. And the question I was asking was, if I transfer this money, would I be a criminal? And they said, yes. Please come in and discuss this with us. Now, I was reluctant to do that because I knew some of the board of directors of the South African Exchange Control Board played golf with Peter Gardner. And I thought that's a little bit too cozy for my safety. So I left it as it was. And I think if we cast our memory back, this is the era of the King's Commission on Corporate Governance. So it's just come in 99. I think all regulators and agencies were really zealous in wanting to make it count and to show and demonstrate that they would act on such a disclosure or a question. And within 7 days of that phone call, this group of men dressed in black suits literally came through the main, the front door of the Leisurenet building, and all senior executives were told to go into the office and leave everything on our desks, our cell phones, our laptops, or leave arch files, and to leave the building. And I felt terrible about that, because my intention wasn't for it to unravel in such a unregulated way. And again, I think if we'd been smarter, from get-go, all of us, it didn't have to be this way. And they said to us, this was a group of SARS individuals, KPMG, forensic accountants, Sonnenbergs, and they had collectively come into the building and said, all of you leave, this company is now under investigation. And my life changed irrevocably from then on.
How did you feel about that? Did you feel unsafe?
I was devastated, and anybody who listens to this will remember me weeping uncontrollably. It felt like this was my family. I'd been with them for 9 years, and I saw my retirement there, and I saw my life being in South Africa, and I felt like I had broken up the family. It really felt that I was that catalyst, and that wasn't a good feeling. And I was afraid as well, but I was also kind of bolshy. I felt that I still had some courage in me to pull the threads for things to unravel in a more transparent way. And why I say that was Peter Gardner had already approached me to get access to the South African Exchange Control files. And I said no. So I knew that if I didn't disclose all this information, a lot of it would be shredded and disappeared. Hence my decision to take the Lever Arch files overseas with me.
So you left the country with the evidence?
Yes. I literally bundled them under
as protection?
posters. No.
Well, protecting the evidence.
Yeah, the evidence. But for me, I didn't feel that I was in any danger at that point. I was devastated, but I didn't feel like I was going to be attacked.
Did you not know how deep it went?
I did, but I wasn't 100% certain.
Oh.
So, for instance, I didn't know this Jersey bank account was Jabir Rabi, Peter Gordon, and Mitchell's bank accounts. And Jersey bank accounts in the year 2000 were very opaque. You couldn't really...
South Africa was very opaque. If you recall, in the year 2000, if you were a director of a company and you sold shares in your company, you didn't have to disclose it.
Wow.
That was Dave King, how he made so much money, and Dimension Data.
Wow, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was a very different country. But fast forwarding now, so you leave the country for good reason.
Yeah.
Any sane person would have done the same. But you took files with you.
Correct.
So what happened when you arrived in the UK? You were a chartered accountant, well qualified.
Yeah.
Little boy with you.
Yeah.
Not easy in a new country, but you did have a British passport.
Yeah, that's right.
What happened from there? Did you get a job easy?
I did, actually. So I got 2 job offers. One from Channel 4, British Television, and one from Richard Branson's Virgin set of companies. And I must say, both of these came through recruitment agents. So they were very separate to what was going on in South Africa. So I went for interviews, got these job offers sort of separately from what was going on here. And even though the Channel 4 job would have given me a much better package and better pension, I chose the Richard Branson job because it was in the health and leisure industry. And I thought of Richard Branson as a great humanitarian and wanted to work with him.
Oh, he's got this incredible image.
Yeah.
Of being a great guy. I've met him, and I've in the interaction, it's almost, oh shucks, very humble. Yeah. But that wasn't actually when reading your story, I've got a very different impression of him now, and maybe you can share.
Yeah, and I think it might shock a lot of people who have the same perception of Richard Branson to hear that I'd taken on this job, international group treasurer, and quite a different...
It's a big job.
It's a big job, right, for the whole set of versions. It was a new job as well. So it was pretty much, Wendy, you do your thing. Now, without me knowing, and I've learned this in hindsight, that the investigators in South Africa had decided to liquidate health and racket clubs. They felt that they would be able to sell off the international arms of Leisurenet, but there would be a challenge to sell off the South African health and racket clubs. And they deemed, let's liquidate this whole company. And somebody, I'm not sure who it was, must have said, hold the horses. We've got 6,000 employees that are going to lose their jobs in South Africa.
At all the gym clubs.
All the gym clubs, the head office, all the regional offices, all these people without jobs. This is a massive hit for the South African economy. Let's call Nelson Mandela. And I think that's a very South African thing, isn't it? So let's call Nelson Mandela.
Well, if you could get Nelson Mandela on your side and he would want to save the jobs.
Exactly, yeah.
And he had a network.
Right? So he would be the messenger for finding someone in his network that might want to purchase the health and racket club companies. So here I am in Notting Hill Gate. I'm fully ensconced in my role. I think I've re-arrived in life. I'm recreating a life for myself. And Nelson Mandela calls Richard Branson. He's in the bath, I believe. Richard shares this on national television, that he gets a phone call from Nelson to say, would you be interested in purchasing this health and racket club? And Richard's, he's an entrepreneur. It's great. I'm in.
Listen, if Nelson Mandela asks you to do something, you do it.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Most South Africans or anyone with a connection to this country.
Absolutely. And so Richard Branson and his financial team then flew off into South Africa. Now, I'm still doing my job. I've been there for about 7 months now in the Virgin head office. I've just had my 3-month job appraisal, and I'm a shining star. There are future projects. It's all going very well. What happens in Cape Town at the Vineyard Hotel, I believe, is Richard Branson meets with Peter Gardner and Rod Mitchell and a few other people.
Who should be in jail, surely, by this stage?
Well, no, there's still the investigation. It's just started, right? So this is 2001. So it's early days. And what I don't think most people knew was that one of the scams Mitchell and Gardner had was the 87 gyms that we had in South Africa. They owned the leases in their personal names.
Just explain that. In other words, they would go and do a deal with a property owner.
Yeah.
They own the lease, and then they sell that on to the listed company.
Correct.
With shareholders, presumably for more money.
Correct.
So they were scamming
their own company.
Wow.
And their own shareholders.
Well, that's why they were supposed to go to jail.
Exactly.
Anyway.
And that's just one of many things. But that meant that Richard Branson had to negotiate directly with Gardner Mitchell. There was no liquidator in the middle. There was no attorney in the middle. It was them. And I've been told by a party who observed this that my name came up in those negotiations. And there was a invitation to Branson to get rid of me in my job back in Notting Hill Gate in London, and they would then negotiate rentals. Because if Branson took over the health and racket clubs with those kind of rental expenditures, there would be no company because they were robbing it. They were literally robbing health and racket clubs, Gardner and Mitchell. And of course, Branson said yes. I became collateral damage, and he flew back, and I was called up and literally marched off the premises in a very Kafkaesque fashion without really any explanation. And
there you are sitting in your office, a really good job.
Yeah.
You're highly qualified, doing well, having had a stellar performance review.
Yeah.
And Branson meets these crooks. They tell him that they won't deal with him unless he gets rid of you. because you're the reason why their company has collapsed or why their fraud has been exposed.
Correct.
And Branson goes along with it.
Yeah.
That's appalling.
It really is. And
he still has this image of being this wonderful, ethical human being who spends a lot of money on corporate responsibility, etc. Maybe he should just look into his own heart.
well,
What do you think about that?
well, it really struck me as a massive betrayal on so many levels, and mainly because it pivoted me out onto the streets. So no one in England would employ me. The case had got sort of going in South Africa. So recruitment agents in England would say, hey, hang on a minute, I've Googled your name and you're a whistleblower in South Africa. And there's no outcome. So as far as we know, you could have stolen the money. Okay. So sorry for you. We're not going to. In fact, one recruitment agent who was very courageous said to me, look, I'll be bold with you. I'm not prepared to jeopardize my position by putting you forward to my potential employers. So that's not going to happen. And then on the other side, I'd been fired without any kind of legitimacy by Richard Branson, this god of entrepreneurship. It's not a good look on CV. So I, in this very diminished, depressed state, I felt like I was operating not only in a foreign world in which I was, the rules are different. I felt like I was operating in a foreign universe when telling the truth didn't matter. You were punished for these things that I thought were good characteristics. And one day I just opened the fridge. There was no food for my son and myself. There was no money to pay rent. And I did what I thought was the best thing at the time and took myself off. We were living in Surbiton. I took myself to Kingston upon Thames outside the railway station and began begging there and squatting in this little house in Surbiton that I had been paying rent for. And I remember to go from boardroom to a beggar sitting on a cardboard box was utterly heart-wrenching for me. And I remember at the time, Richard Branson was on the front page of the UK newspapers because there were a number of Vietnamese boat people attempting to get into Australia and they were barred. And Richard said, I will help these people. And I thought, oh my word, if I could get a journalist to come and interview me now as a senior executive of Virgin sitting on the streets, juxtaposed next to I will help the Vietnamese boat people, this is not a good look for him.
And no journalist was listening?
No one was listening. And
when did it turn?
When the attorneys in South Africa got hold of me. So they realized by going into my office in the old Leisurenet building, there were no leave art files. There were no notes of minutes. There were no treasury meeting minutes, agendas, Excel spreadsheets. They were all gone. And my old PA said, look, you need to give Wendy a call. This is her number. So I had this. Honestly, it piqued my spirits to hear the South African voice saying, we believe you've got the files.
So if you hadn't brought the files or taken the files with you, it would have had a very different outcome.
Absolutely.
So they got hold of you, and then were they able to set you on your feet or at least support you?
Not really. So, and this was the thing, one of the deals I made with them was, I'm on welfare in the UK. I need to have that met. So if I'm coming off welfare and coming into South Africa to help you in your case, I need only my welfare needs met, which they did. There was nothing further than that.
Security?
Yeah, there was an element of security, and also, I wasn't allowed to contact anyone to let anyone know I was coming to South Africa.
Well, you wouldn't want to.
Exactly.
Given the circumstance.
Yeah, and of course, before I left South Africa, my son and myself had a number of death threats. And, they came through the telephone, they came through email, and I persisted. I even got the FBI involved. I'm going many years forward after the case. When I'd sort of cultivated some network in the FBI, I sent them those emails. I said, can you trace where those emails came from? And it was an American company, but it was a sort of info at it was, it could have been anybody.
When we love at BizNews talking to outliers, talking to people who have done things differently, the Davids rather than the Goliaths, and clearly you're an outlier in many senses.
Yeah.
But what happened after that?
They were sentenced in 2007 to 14 and 13 years, and they never went to jail, which was very peculiar. I followed it up with Judge Ace when I was in South Africa in 2008. He wasn't prepared to discuss it with me. But what turned out, and we got his comments on record, where he said, look, it's a no case. There are no victims. This is a case of corruption, and there are no victims. Disregarding myself and my experience, disregarding people who had lost their jobs, disregarding the shareholders who had lost all. So the notion of no victims is utterly it's outdated. Anyway, I got hold of the wonderful advocate Paul Hoffman.
Accountability Now.
Exactly. And he's a good friend of mine. And he's an astonishingly intelligent person. And Grace and working with Transparency International and the OECD and the United Nations, we were able to put the spotlight on Judge Ace and therefore the South African Judiciary Service and go, no, these people have not gone to jail. They were sentenced in 2007. Nothing's happened. And it took from 2008 to 2011 before they actually went into jail.
How long did they serve?
They served only 19 months. They'd been sentenced to the 14 and 13 years.
You got to feel a little resentment about that. Do you know anything about them?
Well, yes. I got a very interesting invitation to meet a banker in a London bank. And he was a pilot for a small pilot community in Oxfordshire. And they rented a field, a drop zone, and an industrial estate right next door in Oxfordshire. And they had been renting it for 20 years. And the reason they were reaching out to me was because they wanted to continue renting the field to fly the aeroplanes. And furthermore, the people that owned the field were Peter Gardner and Rod Mitchell and probably Jabir Rabi under their Jersey or Dalmore Limited, one of the sort of shelf companies in the Jersey bank accounts scenario. And they had tried to renew this lease and nobody had replied to their emails. So the bankers reach out to me was, hey, what's going on with these guys? And well, they're probably in jail. That's why you can't get hold of them. But what occurred to me in that moment was, my goodness, you've got sterling assets here that the liquidators in South Africa should want to know about. I certainly was wanting to put forward a civil claim against them for the loss of my lifestyle, some kind of compensation. And here it was, right in front of me. So I shot off an email to the Scorpions, and I got a very sort of wishy-washy reply, which said, well, thank you for that, but we're not going to follow it up. It's a case that's passed. It's
yesterday.
We've got other stuff going on. And it was so frustrating that they still have these assets.
So they have the assets. Have you heard of them, though? Where are Mitchell and Gardner?
I thought I might bump into them in Hermanus.
Okay.
Because, they bought houses in Hermanus.
I didn't.
Which came through the Leisurenet books.
And your life? What's happened with your life?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my life has been utterly amazing. This is kind of, yes, it's been crappy, right? But I've always said, the more rocks people throw at me, the better my aim becomes. When they were sentenced in 2011, this set me free. Now, most whistleblowers don't get any justice. So whistleblowers, if we really take it back to simple, why do people blow the whistle? They want to stop an unethical behavior. That's all. It becomes a big legal thing, and it becomes a massive fight, and people are killed, and it doesn't have to be that way. So for a lot of whistleblowers, not only in South Africa, but everywhere in the world, they don't get justice. They speak out, they lose their jobs, they go to an employment tribunal, and it's all over. And everything continues as before. For me, there was a line in the sand. People went to jail. And this is something about South Africa as well, I've got to say. With all the negative stuff, there's good stuff there. Because I want to say in South Africa, people have to think outside the box. Mm. There's the slightly more fortitude and preparedness to do things differently. And I think that's where the nub of success is going to lie. I was deeply curious to understand why, as the truth teller, was I subjugated to such horrors? Why did my peer group, who were wonderful, technically competent professional people, all look the other way and actually try to cover up? What was it about Peter and Rod? Good people. They weren't, corrupt individuals. What happened? Did I have some responsibility there? And this is the paradox of having lost everything. I had absolutely everything to gain. And I started picking up the phone and phoning eminent social scientists around the world, mainly in America. And one of those chaps was Professor Dan Ariely of Duke University. And he said, you need to speak to Professor Phil Zimbardo. Now, Zimbardo...
I saw him in Davos, Zimbardo. Isn't he the guy who does he has certain students acting as prisoners and others acting as wardens, and how they take on those roles?
Exactly. So the Stanford prison experiment is very well known. So I think it was in the 60s. That's how long it was. But I phoned him. And it, I look back at him quite scum, quite shy to say, God, what was I doing? But I had nothing to do. So it was like, I want to dig. I want to find out. I need to understand.
Why do people do these things?
Yeah, because we're all vulnerable, right? So what is it about me? What is it about them? Are we so different? So Zimbardo, I interrupted his breakfast inadvertently, the most humble, accessible, smart man. And he said to me, Wendy, I'm going to fly you to Michigan and give you a Heroes Award alongside Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon whistleblower, and Colleen Rowley, the FBI whistleblower. And can we carry on talking?
We can. It's still recording.
Okay.
And it's recording there too.
Okay, all right.
So good old South African load shedding.
Brilliant. So Zimbardo flew me to Michigan, and Zimbardo has a NGO in America called the Heroic Imagination Project. And it's all about ordinary people doing extraordinary things and the cultivation of courage. And so there I was, suddenly pivoted onto a stage with the likes of Daniel Ellsberg and these eminent people. And when I started asking Zimbardo some questions about the work he'd done, so as you know, Alec, he's done this, how do good people become bad? He calls it the Lucifer effect. And my question to him was, but how do we harness the good in people? And he said, that's an excellent question. And I'm going to send you to Stanford to study that. And all of a sudden, I was pivoted going to Stanford University, where I studied the psychological neuroscience of decision making. And this was these were the seeds of my company, Speak Out, Speak Up. And that was 2012. So 2012, 2013, I began this company and began to speak around the world. So from Facebook in California to the Massey Group in the Caribbean Basin, Ernst & Young, I do consulting work for Ernst & Young. Big, large companies, I go to speak about my experience, framed in a way that's helpful for organizations to make better decisions about a very complex area and outside the legislation and processes. My focus is about the human behavior that drives or suffocates the normal desire to be good moral people. And
so you've turned a lemon into some lemonade.
Absolutely. And that feels enormously satisfying. And so I think I'll say with humility, I've played the long-term game. And of course, I'm not finished yet. And one of my desires is to do some work for South Africa. So it feels odd that I do all of this work overseas. I'm a Council of Europe expert in this field now. I write papers for the OECD. I've done a little bit of work in South Africa, but I feel like there's a part of me where, the old saying, when your heart's been in Africa, or Africa's been in your heart, it never loses you. And so I have this deep passion and desire to want to share some of my experience in the South African context, because it seems to be it's going elsewhere.
Well, I'm sure after this interview, you will have enough requests for that. Wendy Addison, lovely talking with you. And I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.